I live 2 houses down, and this is what it used to look like. It's a street, there's a lot of cars, it's still residential, but I just wanted to show you how little it takes to actually change. Of course, I am cheating a little bit because I made this gray, and this isn't color. But the difference is, and I don't know why this is not running. Let's try again. We might have a video issue here, Andre. But anyways, we can explain it from the photos. That is my daughter. And she's walking to school down there. And I had hoped to animate this. But the thing is, she now has a sidewalk to walk across. So the only little difference here is the sidewalk to go through. It's something that we don't necessarily think about, but it's the infrastructure that actually makes it easy and convenient to bike. She's now 12, but she's been walking to school since she was 6 or 7 because she doesn't cross the road anymore. She feels she's walking on a safe sidewalk all the way to the city center. Let's see if the other movements are working, because it does work better if they're animated. This is also one of our inner street seats. This is a typical street that quite wide, a lot of bike lanes. And not long ago, it was moved into this. Luckily, this one works, so let's see if the other ones work as well. If you notice, what happened is it's actually asymmetrical streets. We were also testing this. But traditionally, when we planned our cities, traffic planners would lay out the ideal amount of space for cars on some prognosis of expectation, and they would normally do it completely symmetrical. The way it works is, of course, we as people, we tend to be influenced by climate, by if it's a sunny day, if it feels inviting to walk, if it feels inviting to bike. What we did here is actually the city of Copenhagen changed the entire layout of the street and shifted it over, so we're a little bit more further north than you guys, so we like to sit in the sun. So all of a sudden the sunny side was the bike side. We can create invitations in our cities in a number of different ways. This is Copenhagen, this is called one of the squares in the inner city. It used to be a big parking spot. This is the same situation today. Today it's a great playground. There's a public school there, there's a high school there, and they share this facility. But at the end of the day, it's also the space for everyone in Copenhagen to enjoy. The cars are still there, they're now on the ground in this stage here, but it is of course also about reducing and asking ourselves how do we want to use the space that we have available in our cities. This is another place, and I heard today that you're also opening some of your school playgrounds now. And I think what's interesting for me in a space like this is the city of Copenhagen has done a lot of renovations. So this is an older school. And after they renovated the public spaces, they have opened it up. This is the same space, and it's a shame it's not running, because this is also a video where you see the kids running around. Let me just go back and forth here and see if it's working. Otherwise, yeah. Okay, it's done. When it works, you would have seen something quite naturally. Cars are coming, but also that the kids intuitively respect this line here. When they're running around with their play, they know where to act and be in the city. What's also nice, of course, is from a public investment is that the school is something that we all through our tax pay for. And when you do this and open up the playground, it works for the kids during the school weeks, the days, but it works for, of course, for the city after hours. And then an interesting story, I spoke with one of the former city architects in Copenhagen. They had done a study that normally on Monday mornings they would have a team going around cleaning the schoolyards when they were gated, because when you have a gate, it's interesting for teenagers to climb the fence, and they would climb over the fence on weekends and have a party, so they would have to go and clean up. And they actually did a calculation that in a 10-year period, what they saved on maintenance would have paid for the courtyards to be opened up. So when you look holistically at how you plan your cities, it also works quite well. Let's see if this one works. Copenhagen is also a city, story of a city that has changed quite a bit. This photo, of course, looks extra old because it's black and white, sorry about that again, but it's actually from 1984. It's not that long ago that Copenhagen had industry in the downtown, that the harbor was very much an industrial place. And we were starting to change our water. You are now also developing your waterfront. You have a competition that's running today, and it's a big question about what is the waterfront, who does it belong to, where it is in the city. The space here was an industrial site. The residents where the height were in place. We had started to develop the other side. I'll show you that in a second. But when this side here, they were also considering development. Actually, the local community went together and they went to the city and saying, we don't want this to be developed just with blocked out. We want to create a park. The city at the end accepted and actually had a process where it was designed. And of course, this is what it looks like today. The quite famous Harbour Path in Copenhagen, the park is still in place, the buildings are there. And it told us something about the city and public spaces actually being something that belongs to everyone. And this is the other side, and this is some of the dumber stuff that I mentioned, because we had built quite a lot of offices there that had no relation to the water and didn't offer anything to the public. But of course, what is important to learn is that the city is never done. We can always continue to develop the city. And this place looks like this today. We sort of fixed the problem. We didn't take away the building that was monofunctional, but we actually offered the residents to use it in a different way. GDS designed it this wonderful wave where you can go swimming, you can go bathing in the sun, and you've got a quality out of the space. So it's also to say that we should continue to learn, we should continue to develop our cities as we go along. And of course, part of this is because we need to upgrade our spaces, is based on demand. And some of the demand is also based on climate change. So this is another space in Copenhagen. This is the same space today. And this is a climate adaptation project. And I think part of the logic here is that we need to deal with stormwater. I think you have the flooding from the Donau. We have cloudbursts from time to time, heavy rain that floods the area. And that forces us to invest in actually doing permeable surfaces and green spaces and actually make areas that can take over and delay water before it goes into the drainage. What is important when we do these projects, they shouldn't just be projects that solve technical issues. They actually become an improvement of a neighborhood. This is called the climate neighborhood, and they build a new identity to them. It used to be primarily residential, and now it actually has a square, and at the same time are dealing with the climate issues that we have at hand. Here's the last little video here, and I want to point out, it'll loop a little bit, but what you'll see is just this, it's back to being simple. It's that first sidewalk. If you notice here, buses and bicycles get a 6-second green light for the car traffic. That means the buses go in front of the car traffic and the bicycles go in front of the car traffic. And of course what it means is you don't have the right turning accidents on the bikes. You don't need dedicated bus lines everywhere because the bus go in front of the traffic and the traffic waits for the bus. But at the end of the day, it's about prioritizing green mobility and making it easy and convenient to actually use public transport. And of course you have the benefit when you're sitting on your bicycle in Copenhagen to look at the car, the big BMW, and say, meh, you go first. And so you have that opportunity there. Copenhagen didn't happen because we got lucky. Some of the things were really great citizen engagement that started movements like Eastern Brygge, but at the end of the day, it's also aligning strategies. So one of the things that has allowed Copenhagen to change quite dramatically since the 1980s, where the city was close to bankrupt, is that we've done a number of major projects, but also that we have some strategies that have led to all these changes that we see. So in 2007, the city did a strategy where it was the first time to use data, not just to measure how the city is performing, but actually to proactively say, we want to go here, this is where we want to be, and politically vote for that. So they said 80% should be satisfied with urban life 8 years later, 20% should walk in the city, 20% should stay longer. We had architected policies. I was lucky enough to have the first quote. It was really interesting for me because the architected policy wasn't about doing, of course it was also about doing fantastic architecture, but the opening quote was about doing architecture that had to do with the human scale and the senses and the tactility that happens at night. So just this whole notion that through the strategies that we have, to have that kind of human aspect to it. This is the Good, Better, Best, the city bicycle strategy in Copenhagen that has been supported and developed over time. This is just another example of how we developed the waterfront. There was originally something called the Blue Plan, which I think goes back to 2007. This is a little bit newer. This is the Blue Ring. Right now we're building a number of new bike bridges across the water in bike and pedestrian. What is interesting is this one was the first to open. It was expected to have 4,000 bikes per day, and I think it has now 20 to 25,000 bicycles per day, and that's been true of every bike bridge that we've done. But it also tells a different story. When the city doesn't build car bridges, but start to build bike and pedestrian bridges, it shows something about what you prioritize. It shows how you as the city prioritize this, but it also makes new connections. So all of some things that used to be far away on your bicycle gets very close by. So this notion of how we use our different neighborhoods, how we utilize our neighborhood, become a different story. I want to just touch very briefly on some of the new developments that are happening in Copenhagen. So one of the ones that are almost done being built now is Carlsberg. It's a brownfield transformation. Carlsberg is a beer. If they're not listening, I might say you have better beers, but it's a really good Danish beer. And they wanted to do a neighborhood because they were moving the brewery out of the city center in Copenhagen, which made a lot of sense. What was interesting with them was at the time we did competition brief that first asked for what kind of light do you want to see on this site or provide to the architect. They then asked how does the ground floor, the streets and the public spaces relate to each other. And last, how do you deal with sustainability? So the architect's question was actually not how do you provide X number of square meters, but it was about quality. And it was about the things that you actually experience walking around. It was an open competition. There was more than 400 entries. Entities won the master plan. They are our local office in Copenhagen, a smaller office, but a really good planning office. But they had actually mostly done building it. But they won, and it was anonymous, but they won because they actually did a written interpretation of Carlsberg or of Copenhagen with the block structure. They put in some high rises for the density, but they also did proper street layout where public spaces and street were defined. This is just the orange, is the new part. The darker buildings is the historical buildings that kept. We're lucky that there was a park there on the side. It's also interesting because it was the first time the city of Copenhagen in a regulative plan actually defined the different types of ground floor activity. So to commercial, residential, offices, and also where they should be in the plan. So the scale of the public spaces and the quality of the ground floor. It wasn't a design guideline saying they needed to be blue and dotted. It was a quality description of what should happen at the ground floor. That has later become something that's in most of the plans. Then the plan was ready, and 2008 came, and the crisis was there. So they had moved out the brewery. It looked like an industrial site because it had been for 150 years, and they were not ready to build because they couldn't build the quality that they wanted. They started then with doing temporary public spaces, so they invited people in to actually use the area, and they invited people to play in the area. And that became the image of Carlsberg. This was quite fun. This was early day smartphone, so you could put your smartphone in an analog speaker and it would make it loud, so you could lay in the hammock and enjoy your favorite movie. Oh, sorry. The hammock is over there and the speaker is there. But most importantly, those public spaces actually became the image of Carlsberg. So when they finally started building, the public spaces were what people expected, this kind of playfulness. And later it has become a thing for Carlsberg to actually reintroduce the playfulness in the permanent in the area. What was also very important in that story is, and I'll get back a little bit later, is Copenhagen has built out a metro system since the 1990s. I'll talk a little bit about it with the next case that we have here. Carlsberg originally had hoped to get a station on the Ring Metro. They didn't, but next to Carlsberg, this is the brewery side over here, next to Carlsberg was an old rundown station. And they went in and had a dialogue with the Danish Rail and actually co-financed moving it here. And now there is a Carlsberg station. So that means that when you arrive on Carlsberg, you arrive on Carlsberg station. I have to say it's probably one of the best station to urban development spaces I know of, because you get right up the station, and then there's a square where there's absolutely no cars. There is a kiss and ride, but otherwise it's pedestrian and bicycles. And you walk directly into the urban network of Carlsberg. And this is what you're met with, spaces that are designed for people. Carlsberg is also quite unique because it has really active ground floor with the commercial entity that's coming in. It has a huge variety of different kind of functionalities. So this is actually Villadsen, which is one of our famous clothes designer, has both a studio and a small shop on the side. So we're also seeing new kind of hybrid retail, but you also have an urban network that actually feels like a city. And this is private land. And at the end of the day, even the roads are owned by the housing owners, the building owners, the offices that are there. But everything is designed to look like Copenhagen. So when you look at the bike lanes, when you look at the sidewalk, it really feels like Copenhagen. And it also means that Carlsberg is actually functioning like just any other Copenhagen. It's also proper mixed. So it's 50% residential and 50% everything else, meaning that it's offices, school, education, and of course retail. So it feels like a neighborhood. But when you also do something where you have proper mix, it also means that there are some people that live there that will go out, go to work, come home in the evening, but other people are coming in, going to school and working there. So from a sustainable point of view, you also get a much better use of the investment we do in the infrastructure that we have to do when we build a city. CO2 embedded in doing streets, stations, all these kind of things is much more efficiently used because it's used all the time by multiple people in the area. Just a few more images from Carlsberg. One of the great things with the plan that INSIS came up with is also that it does have a central square. This is it. It's not gigantic, it is rather rich, but it feels like a neighborhood square. So people in the area use it, but other people are coming in to use it. But then it's just one of 25 squares in total. So that tiny area of 33 hectares actually has 25 small public spaces. So that means if you live here, you're in the square with a good wine bar that's in there. So all of a sudden you're not just living in Carlsberg, but you're living somewhere that you can relate to. And as a kid, you're living with the one with the stick playground. You can start to actually talk about where you live, and you can also talk about when do I arrive and feel that I belong somewhere. I think this sense of belonging in community is something that we'll see grow in importance. We notice that globally loneliness is one of the biggest challenges that we're facing. In Copenhagen, we discussed it earlier today, but in Copenhagen we're down to, I think, 1.2 person per household. A little bit higher in Bratislava, but you're going in that direction. We're living more and more alone in our life in different periods, and this notion of actually belonging becomes incredibly important. This is just some of the community that's happening up there. Of course, this is for everyone, but it's also for the people that live there. And you have your flea markets, even though it's a new build area built over a 10-year period, it does feel like a proper neighborhood in the city. And of course, not everything is retail because it's also a residential area. But the residents have small gardens. You have a little bench where you can talk with your neighbor, you can park your bicycle. So you also have this kind of notion of welcome home. And of course, you can have a road cut for the front garden up to a public playground. And actually the public playground is also a climate flood protection thing. So it actually have a double service, this notion of doing twice the thing. And the playfulness back in, sorry to my daughter, she's a reoccurring character here. But again, this kind of playfulness is in place in the city that was initiated with the early activation. And it is an area that everybody uses. It really is a place where people live there. A lot of them do have high income, but it's a place that is used by everybody in the city. It is that diverse. As briefly mentioned, the competition brief was called Our City, because at the time Carlsberg had a slogan called Our Beer, and they really wanted it to be inclusive. Just another development that we have here is the North Harbor development. It was a great office Cooper that won the competition. We have here the before and the after. But more importantly, it was part of the metro model of Copenhagen. And I don't know if you're familiar with this, but Copenhagen had started back, the idea started in the 80s. It was first Ørestad in 93. But the idea is that you take some public land and you let the public land finance the metro, but you build the metro first. So they started with Ørestad, the first 2 metro lines, and that paid for the metro when they then developed the land. And the same they're now doing with North Harbor, so they built the Ring Metro, which is financed by the North Harbor, but they take the loan, build the metro, and then they build the land. That also means that public transport is in place from the start. So you have that notion of actually having public transport as the core in the new development. This is what it looks like from above where they are at. They built a little bit more since this photo was taken. Just as in Carlsberg, they had the perimeter block as a thing. They had the quality of the ground floor. The great thing, of course, about the perimeter block is it defines very clearly something as public street and something as more privately occupied. But when you walk through Nordhavn, just as in Komárek, you actually have something that feels like public streets. You feel welcome to go through the area. You have, sorry about this quality here, you have soft edges, the residential edges, part of it, similar to commercial. Just this narrow stairway so that you can go down and sit in front of a house is quite nice. You have the more row houses in here as well, and you have the small courtyards that allow you to come outside and have your private garden. And it still feels public. You can go here, hang out, have a beer in the sun. You have the squares where the ground floor is full together with the public spaces. In the new developments in Copenhagen, we don't have underground parking anymore for two reasons. First of all, we're bringing down the parking norm. So right now in the new developments in Copenhagen, they're down to, I think, one parking spot per 300 square meters. So quite a low parking norm for users, those of you that are nerdy enough to know what that means. But also, very importantly, these new developments, we don't put the underground parking, we put it in parking houses from the idea that you could actually potentially remove it if you don't need parking long term, but also that you don't have your car in your house. So when you get out your door, you will have to make a choice: do I walk, bike, use the metro, or do I want to walk a couple of hundred meters to that parking house and go up and get my car? So it's again about creating a sustainable behavior in the new neighborhood. Small squares and public spaces are still part of it. Transformation is a big part. Both Carlsberg and Nordhavn is of course also brownfield transformation. And I think, in all honesty, this is what we need to look at in Europe today. We have so much industry site on old industry sites in our cities. We do need still, people are moving to cities, so we do need to provide new neighborhoods and vibrant neighborhoods. But we need to provide it on areas that are already part of the city. The great thing about a brownfield is it's already close to public transport, it's close to the street network. It can borrow a little bit from the surrounding city, but more importantly, it can give something back. If it's sold properly, it means that you have a new neighborhood tomorrow that makes your city richer and better place. So in many ways, we should really look away from the greenfield developments, which is taking up land and biodiversity, and move toward the brownfield side. Just some more images. The parking house quite blatantly has this roof. I'm sure you've seen the images of it before. Well done by Yaya. I want to say just a little bit of what's happening next, and then I'll end up with talking a little bit about what sustainable behavior might be. So really interesting in Copenhagen, originally in 1947 was this finger plan where the public transport went. Later we got the metro system. And just last year, Vandkot, a really nice Danish office, did a new interpretation of this finger plan. And in many ways, Copenhagen is still developing along those fingers. But the municipality of Copenhagen is just in here. So it doesn't stretch out on the fingers. And the focus still on residential needs is still inside the city center. We also have plans like this is Villadsen, which is actually an artificial island that is now literally being built. I took this photo from an airplane. So it's going to be the flood protection, but it's also going to provide 35,000 new residents in Copenhagen in a few years. And it's there, this is me and my family walking there just to show that it's not a Photoshop or a fake. They are building it. It is debated if this is the right thing to do, because of course those figures that I saw before, you could also push some of the development out there where you already have public transport. But what it does is it protects the harbor front, and it's just as Nordhavn and Villadsen before that, it's financing the next step of the metro and infrastructure in the city. And this is just trends that I think is interesting. So we also have now a very strong building stock movement. If you ask the architect students, there was just an article 2 days ago that the architect students think we should stop building new altogether from a climate perspective. I think that's also interesting to say here in the House of Architecture in Bratislava. They are all into transformation. And actually just today there was announced the next phase of Nadácia. Nadácia is this old industry site. You have the winter harbor. And one of the things that has changed the Nadácia in the process is now they say remain or explain has become a thing that Danish politicians even say, but here they're preserving everything. So all the old industry was part of the brief for the master plan competition, 110 hectares, and this is the old shipyard factory, and I can't remember, 50, 60 meters tall, but that has to be part of the master plan of the future, because we also realize that today everything that we have already built represents CO2 that we have already used. It also represents history and an opportunity to create something that is quite unique. What we also see is publications are coming out like the Copenhagen Way, where we're saying this transformation that Copenhagen has done over the last 30 years is quite unique. is there some learnings here that we can use and to help the cities across Europe to actually deal with the challenges we have. And I think a lot of the things that we are looking at, climate change, these kind of things, we need our cities to solve them. And I'll get back to that in just a second. Oh yeah, and then just this, just to say that North Harbour, now you saw the urbanization, they're also now building a new park, 30 hectare big, out at the end. And what's interesting is they're going to build the park first and then let the city grow out there. So it also becomes a city park and not just a neighborhood park to start with. So that's opening up next week. And then I wanted to bring something forward because the climate strategy for Copenhagen touches on something that I think is really interesting. We have a lot of debate and we talked a little bit, I had a chance to walk around Villadsen today, but there's a lot of focus on building sustainable square meters in Denmark in general and also in Copenhagen. And I would say around the world. We can talk a little bit more about it, but we are getting better and better at building with a local CO2 program. We're not there. We're still responsible for loads of our pollution coming from the building industry, but we are getting better. But this is interesting. The city of Copenhagen has a strategy for 2035 of halving the per capita global CO2 emission. And this is where sustainable behavior becomes important. Because if we base our life choices on the physical form of the city, we have an opportunity to actually invite people to live there. And it is this way that we know 40% of global CO2 emission comes from the building industry. We also know Kate Rayward made us aware with the donut model of the planetary boundaries. In Copenhagen, in Denmark, we have the reduction roadmap, which is actually all in the industry that has gone together and are influenced national policy to lower the CO2 demand, not to lower the CO2 demand, but actually to heighten it by lowering it, if that makes sense. So we now have to build to a lower standard because that means it's equal competition, so that the developers are happy to join in. But this is what is also really important to me. This is the Danish footprint. A quarter of what I pollute with in terms of CO2 is how I live. At the end of the day, this means how many square meters I live on. It's a quarter is transportation. How do I go around? How far do I go? 20% is food. That's more difficult because that's a personal choice, but it has a lot to say what we do. And then there's something public safety and something else. But that means that actually 3/4 roughly of what we do is very strongly related, and at least half of it is very strongly related to our cities. And I think we have a chance to, if we take sustainable behavior seriously, we can actually, with our urban form, shape how we consume, share, move, walk, work, and live in our community. And we know this with mobility is changing. Actually, it's going really well in parts. In Denmark now, I just read yesterday that 82% of all new cars sold in Denmark are electric. So we're electrifying, but it doesn't necessarily talk about the infrastructure. Nordhavn did a study, there's a really great PhD with Google. We did a study where it says a quarter of the CO2 footprint from North Harbour is actually infrastructure and car parking infrastructure. So the infrastructure related to the parking industry still is a quarter of the CO2 new development. And that doesn't go into the calculation of it. And that's a dense urban area. Imagine if we're doing urban sprawl. Then the percentage of infrastructure is much higher to the density of housing. So when we're doing suburbia, that equation will look far worse, much more to CO2 going there. So we don't know where mobility is going. I don't know if Thomas Hedderwick's self-driving living room here is ever going to happen, but I know that the infrastructure will still be needed until we actually probably learn to share or simply walk and bicycle public transport. And of course you know this as well, 92% of the time a European car is actually parked. It's not in use, it's just sitting there, taking up space in our cities and being our source. And then very importantly, roughly a quarter of our cities are streets. So when we look globally, somewhere between 20 and 30% of the area of all cities are streets. And what that means, it's up to 60 to 80% of our public spaces. So if we want to do something with our public spaces, we have to look at our streets and what they're like. Copenhagen have done that. We've been lucky to have a bicycle strategy for years. And as a result, we're now up to, I think, 65% in the last time we did that. So 65% commute on their bicycle to work, to school, and on a daily basis of the people living inside the city border. But the reason why I took this photo in This is from the mobility study that the city of Copenhagen did. 49% of the road is still given to cars. So this is not about banning cars, and I think this is really important to say. It's about the other 51%, which is the bike lanes, the pedestrian zones. It's not about saying we want completely car-free cities. We just want a better balance in our cities. And of course, what's really nice is when you ask people why they bike in Copenhagen, it's not because it's healthy or good for the environment or cheap. It's because it's easy, fast, convenient. So by providing an infrastructure, we've actually created an invitation to change behavior. And we see that going around. We've all seen, I'm sure, these fantastic air pollution maps of Paris. Over the last 20 years, they've gone from being highly polluted to being less polluted. What is, of course, interesting about this is it also leads to greening. It leads to a different kind of health environments in our city, quite physically, but also in terms of building communities. So when we work with these kind of things, and I've seen lots of nice examples of this happening also here in Bratislava today, it is a different kind of situation. When we do these designs, we also deal with this of actually providing spaces where we can meet each other. I mentioned this before, but loneliness is one of the biggest, fastest growing challenges that we have from a mental illness. And it was very interesting last year, Villadsen, we have a fantastic foundation in Denmark that works with the built environment, did the biggest study of life quality ever done in Denmark. They asked, I think it was 120,000 Danes, what actually makes life quality for you. Now I put it up there, so maybe you had read it already. But the surprising answer was that you say hello to someone in your neighborhood. And the interesting part is, it didn't matter if you knew them, and if they were good friends, but just that you recognize them and they recognize you enough to say hi. That was the number one component in actually making life quality. This sense of creating and building communities and creating places that you belong, I think is incredibly important. I've seen a number of the new developments here in Bratislava today, and I think, I won't mention any names, but I think I will know which one in 5 years' time, where people were saying hello to each other because they meet each other in streets and public spaces and the cafe in the corner, and which one they wouldn't necessarily know who their neighbor was, even if they lived there for the last 5 years. So I think this is something we have to take into consideration. And we know that this with retail and commercial activity is not challenged by necessarily the accessibility of cars. We know that from a study in Copenhagen and elsewhere that actually pedestrians and bicycles are the number one users of ground floor retail. So if you want that lively city, this is actually important. I mentioned this before, but the whole notion with climate adaptation of our cities can be something that actually brings new quality to the city. And we should always challenge ourselves with these questions, and I think you're doing that in practice that as well, to how can we work with these things. This is the difficult one, because this is what we eat. And I'm not going to tell you what to eat, but I can tell you this, that they did a study in Denmark, and if you replace just 3/4 of the beef you ate and replaced it with just about anything else of meat, you don't have to go vegetarian, that would take away 1 ton of CO2 per person per house, just by giving up on 3/4 of the beef you would normally eat. So you can take that with you. I'm not asking you to become vegetarian, it's just good knowledge to have, that what we eat actually means quite a lot. And just to put it into perspective, 1 ton per person. In Denmark, embarrassing enough, we have a 13 ton per person CO2 personally. To live up to the 1.5 degree Paris Agreement, I think we have to go to 3.5, all of us globally. Right now, we are very far from it. So it won't be enough that we manage to build very sustainable housing. It will also matter how we live our life and how we actually invite for sustainable behavior. We see a lot more of this transformation, and we know that today, actually the construction of materials is far less than the maintenance. This is a master plan I was lucky enough to work with my time at Karel. Here we're actually transferring an office building into residential, but also everything that was on site were kept on site, material bank, and reused by the architects. So everything that was taken down was actually literally reused and never left the plot. So this kind of transformations I think we'll see more in the future, but I think it also goes to actually evaluating the fact that what is already built represents CO2 already used, and we should be very careful in considering whether we take it down or not. This is just on play. This is in Billund, the hometown of Lego. Here, Kirby did a new master plan, and for me this is quite interesting. First of all, we started by defining values and place for everyone. You saw the first photo of the swings with the old guys sitting there. So it's not just a thing about children, but if it's good for children, it works for all. It's a balanced everyday life, so it's about sustainable behavior. It's communities, it's about belonging and identity. And then it's Read and Billund. This is the master plan. They are building right now the first structure. They are sitting here, so it's not just imaginary. They built the park before they built anything else. So by the time the residents move in, the trees will have grown and they have a biodiversity. But they are also taking on the responsibility of testing new materials to bring the CO2 down. So they're building in unburned clay, wood, these kind of structural biogenic materials to actually go far below the legal requirements, but they're also taking on the risk of doing this. And as Kristian, the project director, says, we freely share the knowledge we gain, and the opportunities that can be created from this are, in fact, where the real benefits lie. So he has to deliver some square meters, but he actually thinks the knowledge that they do in the process that can influence the industry is equally important as the result that is standing there as we're building. This is again from Carlsberg, but this is just to say why it's also important to consider what we live and how we live. Remember, 25% of what we do come from how we live. What's interesting in Denmark, since 1990, we've done a lot of stuff to insulate our housing better, to build more sustainable, to put more requirements on. But everything we have done is zeroed out by the fact that we now have more heated area because we got wealthier. So everywhere we are going up in scale. A one-family house in the 1990 in Denmark was on average 130 square meters. Today it's on average 235. If you live in a one-family house, you have on average 75 square meters per person. We cannot can't build sustainable enough to live up to the fact that we consume more square meters. What is really nice to say about Copenhagen is the one city in Denmark. Aarhus has zeroed out, Copenhagen has actually dropped, so we're now living on fewer square meters. It goes into discussion about affordability. You have to live on fewer square meters to be able to afford. That's of course not a positive. But the positive is, it is because of all these changes that the strategies that are implemented in Copenhagen, it is so attractive to live in Copenhagen that we're willing to live on fewer square meters to be in the city. And I think that's why the European city can be part of this answer, because when we live in cities, we share walls, we share public transport, we share infrastructure, and we live on a little bit less, and we share a little bit more. And that's where we have to go with sustainable behavior. If a city is designed for children, it's designed for everyone, and its urban form will maybe invite for sustainable behavior. That's not the idea, that's just me. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristian, very much. Let's sit down for questions. This was a really inspiring talk with so many topics covered that I can hardly think of where to start the discussion. It's so many topics that are resonating for Bratislava, and for me, I suppose, the strategies that align and the arrows that you showed us at the beginning are very much what we are living through or trying to work through at the moment. For the last maybe 10 years, Bratislava has been transforming a lot, and we've been trying to align those arrows to kind of go forward together as a stream. And so I wanted to first of all ask you, what do you think, where was the momentum in Copenhagen, where those streams started to align, and was it, I suppose, a combination, but was it political leadership, was it activism, was, where do you feel there was momentum? I mean, Karel himself was probably also quite a big figure in that movement, so.
Yeah, so I think it's well, as I said, it's not one thing, but it was luckily a lot of things aligning. Some of it was strategy, some of it was history. So in the 70s, we had a very strong grassroots movement that is up against building highways coming through the city center. We were lucky that already in the early 1980s, I think the city took the traffic department and the green department and putting together a schedule in our public space department, forcing the traffic planners to think about the streets and public spaces, but also the green department to think about the green not just as green, but actually as something that is a quality and activity. So there were some things that were structural, there was something that were bottom up, also the waterfront part that I showed was a bottom up example. But then we also had, in the 80s, we had a mayor, Komárek, who came up with the notion of actually doing this with the City and Harbour project where the metro was built. And at the time, the city was bankrupt, or close to bankruptcy. So in the late 80s, people were fleeing the city, it was very problematic. And they came up with this idea of saying, why don't we use some of our land to finance something that would drive new developments, but also giant the city. And that was then followed up by some of these strategies that we saw that had to do with public life quality that has been super influential. And it is interesting because in around 2000, the expectation to number of kids living in Copenhagen was so low that the city didn't plan for schools and kindergarten. And then the strategies and the investment went into public spaces to actually make the quality of living better. And then it came to a point where there was a lack of schools and a lack of kindergartens because people didn't move out. They stayed even then they had the first or second year. Now it's stabilizing a little bit again, and maybe it has to do with prices and affordability. That's something we can discuss as well. But these changes happen, and I think as cities we have to navigate.
I mean, I think it's great that you reminded us of this sort of the rise and fall of the cities and the fact that Copenhagen was a city where people were moving out and you know, I think many people can't imagine that right now if you visit the city and that there was this big demographic shift, but also of this financial model with the metro, which I think is interesting because the state sort of came in heavily to help with that at the beginning, and now this model is actually almost fully city-owned. So Villadsen, which is the city development company, is owned by 95%, I believe, by the city, and I think this is very interesting where the state administration and the city at that time had actually come up with a financial strategy, because I suppose this is one of the big challenges for cities, the financial model, and in our context we have a lot of course, the private ownership and how does the city negotiate and collaborate and how do we do public-private partnerships. So I wanted to ask you about your thoughts about how this collaboration can be better and those streams can align. We had a really productive workshop this afternoon with different participants. So maybe your observations and what you would advise Bratislava, but also other European cities in terms of the collaboration, because the city can't build itself. There's so many stakeholders.
So I think we need to create cities that are more sustainable. We need to create cities where you actually feel that you belong, where you feel where you're invited to the city to actually have a more sustainable life, but also community that deals with some of all these other issues that is also a city, the health issues, the sense of community. That's our challenge. That's where we, of course, have to go. This is, in many ways, something that we agree on. We all have these kind of images of a lively city where there's good public transportation, but the road is not so clear. And part of it is actually history. Most cities around the world have different kind of administration, just like the traffic department, green department, Copenhagen. You have different kind of units that doesn't necessarily are used to collaborating. This is changing rapidly these years. You can also facilitate collaboration, and of course you have to develop on the side. But more importantly, we're often also stuck with dated regulation. So I read at one point that 90% of global planning regulation is written from 1950 to 1970. With all respect, that's probably where we've built the worst cities ever. So to actually build the future and build the vision that we are all to some extent sharing, we are stuck with maybe both a structural challenge, but also a regulative challenge of dated regulation. And that is something where cities need to perform and where cities can perform. You have these wonderful C40 networks and elsewhere where say we're actually stepping ahead of national policy and testing and learning new stuff. because we need to do that to find solution, and we need to compare notes. So I was lucky enough to work out of Copenhagen and lived there for the last 25 years, and it's a wonderful city because of a number of things. But there's wonderful elements in each city, and we need to learn from each other, and I think that's immensely important. To your question, it is really important we find ways to collaborate now, where regulation aside and structures aside, we find solutions and we can facilitate processes where we can find each other. I've done a number of these both with master plan cities and developers, and on both sides of the table. At the end of the day, we're more agreeing than we're disagreeing. We just need ways to find a common platform for that agreement.
We talked about this common platform or the visioning process at the beginning, at the outset of the project, how important that is, and perhaps sometimes it's fast-tracked because you have a plot of land and you're like, okay, well, we want a mixed-use quarter. I mean, how complicated can that be? Let's just run ahead and get it done because the planning is going to be an itemized, it's going to take ages and so on. But actually, when we talked about investing into that initial visioning process and getting all of the stakeholders on board with the values and the vision what we are trying to create together, then actually the long-term value is better and the process is smoother. And we've been trying with our institute to work on these larger urban plans where we are bringing together the different stakeholders, landowners, and we are talking about what kind of city do we actually want. What we are answering that question collectively rather than individually, because we have to find the consensus between the different parties. And the other big topic before I open to the questions to the audience, you can also post them on Slido for those of you who are connecting online. Was to do with the belonging, and I really liked what you described earlier today when we discussed when you said if you feel you have arrived only when you have closed the door of your apartment or your house, then that neighborhood has failed. And I thought that was a very strong way of talking about this idea of belonging, which you beautifully described in your talk. Like, is it this playground with the sticks, or is it the corner wine bar that is next to my neighborhood? And I feel like this is a transformation process which is very relevant and very much also happening in Bratislava. And in Bratislava it's been happening through the transformation of public spaces very much, and the sense of belonging of the shared space that we now have, with examples like the Freedom Square or even the school streets and the surroundings of school communities. I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more on this belonging, because it seems so important and so critical in the success of those neighborhoods, and you described in Carlsberg how successful it has been, and I was lucky last year to have a very, very quick tour with you of even the sort of water attenuation sports pitch and so on. So a little bit more on that, and then we can take some questions from the audience.
Well, I think it is important that we feel that we have an ownership, and this is not a legal question, but we should feel that we can take ownership to our public spaces, that we are part of it. It's also important that it isn't just for the residents, it should also be the working area, but more importantly, it should be for the entire city. As I said, with the brownfield developments, it's a chance to both borrow something from the city, but also give something new back. So we end up with a richer city at the end. I think Siddhartha said this, that the sum of the parts is bigger than the whole. And there's something about doing these kind of interventions. I do think that we need to create communities. I think this has to do with our physical health, is the hello at the end of the day that we feel recognized. We can do some of this with, some of it is regulation. In Denmark you have to provide community spaces when you're building residential. So a lot of these community spaces are part of the ground floor or community houses that are in the new neighborhood. So it's simple regulation. But it's also giving, whether it's a public space or a community building or something that is a courtyard, it gives you something that you share. And the minute you share something, you also engage and you become really stronger in that sense of belonging somewhere because you're engaging with other than yourself.
And you're kind of building a sense of responsibility towards the environment and the neighborhood, and you suddenly know those people and those spaces. We have some quite technical questions up there, and just before we go to them, I had a question about, there's quite a lot of back and forth in the conversation and trying to align those arrows in who should take responsibility for what. And you showed very nicely these examples where, you know, private ownership can actually look like a city structure that completely integrates within the wider city, and there's a win-win scenario. So what are the tools besides, you know, you mentioned community spaces, the regulation, what other tools, hard or soft, are there to actually have those conversations and those collaborations where you incentivize that lively neighborhood? Because this afternoon we heard about some examples of projects where it was invited and some where it was felt that it was more of a restrained approach, and the housing was supposed to be a little bit more premium and quieter public spaces were being thought of as wished for. Whose responsibility and how to negotiate that conversation? Because if the land ownership is private, but then there's an idea, a strategy that the city wants to propel, how can we achieve it, and how can it be win-win for all?
But I think what we learned in Copenhagen is the city has a fairly strong mandate to go into the dialogue with regulative plan, building permits, these kind of things. My wife is here with me today. She said does some of the local plans. She would be better at answering this, to be honest. But of course, and she would sometimes say they don't have enough control. But of course, there are things that you can put in. You can put in community spaces as a requirement in a local plan. We have right now in Denmark, all areas that master plan area that needs to be regulated. You have by the planning law that every city can demand 25% affordable housing to be built. And in Carlsberg, out of the 50% of Carlsberg that's residential, 25% is affordable housing. And we have affordable housing associations that provide that. That is a challenge right now, but because they are actually, by different law, they can only build to a certain price. So right now they're lacking a little because it is expensive to build in Europe these days and in Copenhagen. But we are doing this different kind of regulations. So there's some things that you can do in that. I think a lot of it is also that negotiation in that process. That being said, there is also a growing understanding with developers that this is actually done with creation. So if you are a developer and you can build something like Carlsberg and Nordhavn, it's that creating a lively neighborhood is super attractive. We have huge companies moving from downtown Copenhagen to stay in Carlsberg or stay in Nordhavn because it's an urban environment where you can actually go out and have a beer, what you call it when you're at the end of the day, or you feel that you're actually living in something that is a neighborhood. And quite interesting, I think Carlsberg is nowhere near the water. Nordhavn, of course, is on the water. Normally you would say the waterfront itself would drive the prices up, and it's not that it's cheap in Nordhavn, but I think the prices are more or less the same in Carlsberg because there's other urban qualities that people value. So from a developer point of view, they're also understanding the value of actually delivering a good urban fabric.
I suppose the rising competition between them, because they're all, you know, the quality is very high, so actually if you want to be successful, also financially, in terms of the viability, you need to deliver those additional benefits and for everyone. Let's have a look at some of these questions. So there's quite different areas of questions there, but what have you observed about Bratislava this afternoon, Kristian, and perhaps in comparison from 8 years ago? We looked at more of the new housing and mixed-use developments, but we talked quite a bit about the public spaces, and tomorrow you'll be looking at more of those. So, you should tell us about the observations where the projects are not yet in progress started. So I suppose that's a question about what do you think about the ones that haven't been done yet? I mean,
yeah. So the first thing to say, of course, it was really nice to be back. I biked around the city today, and I actually didn't feel in danger. There was bike lanes, and it was quite a nice experience. I also walked. I also did that 7-8 years ago, and it wasn't quite the same experience, with all respect. So a lot of things have happened. I also see new developments here that share some of the qualities that I see elsewhere around the world, not just in Copenhagen, but working globally. So I see a lot of things that are moving in the right direction. I think it's really interesting. Now you have the Winter Harbor competition that is coming up these days. You have A lot of new brownfield sites need to be developed. To have a discussion about how much can we actually build and still keep a public waterfront? How much do we need to maintain, both from a sustainable point of view, but also from that sense of having a character in a place, that it looks like a unique. I think the most wonderful thing with brownfield is that you get these little obstacles, the existing buildings that you have to, that invite you to have a dialogue as an master plan. That you create these kind of spaces that has a uniqueness that you could never create from scratch, which is really, really interesting. So there is something about hopefully preserving some of these qualities.
The remain or explain.
The remain or explain is an issue both from a sustainable point of view, but also for this sense of belonging and us being aware of our history. I think it's really interesting. We have a lot of developments also in Denmark that looks like some of the developments you have south of the Denmark. What we're seeing now is that a lot of them are also being transformed, but a lot of them are not necessarily taken down. They're transformed from an environmental point of view, from a quality point of view, but also densified within those structures. A lot of them have a lot of green space surrounding it, where you can offer different kind of technologies, maybe different kind of options. So I think there's things there that, what would I like to see? I think that would be nice. I think what's happening with left salary in this competition that actually were the winners were announced today, I think you should make a partnership with what you're doing on the harbor here and learn from each other, because it's going to be very parallel processes.
It'll be interesting. We'll certainly be following that. There's a question about the conflict between sustainable building and affordability. Do they have to be in conflict? Can affordable housing be sustainable?
I think, of course, and of course there's also social sustainability, but I think we have a fantastic developer called Komárek that are working right now with a model where they first of all build highly sustainable, but also trying to make affordable rental units, and also actually have a model where I think they to some extent share the profit with the renter. So if people are taking care of their home, they get a bonus at the end of the year, of course, with rent back. They're looking at new financial models for actually providing affordable housing while having incredibly high sustainable standards. So there's a number of these kind of projects that are coming in. And of course, we have, because we by law have 25% of the areas in regulated plan in our bigger cities being set aside for affordable housing. The Affordable Housing Association are also interested in building sustainable, so they are also doing that. So I don't think it's necessarily a conflict, and it's not necessarily, it shouldn't be more expensive to build sustainable.
Yeah, and it seems like those clever financial models actually really would be interesting to explore for another forum, another talk, really to go deep dive into that, because that seems to be unlocking a lot of potential to have these new financial models for housing. Somebody's concerned about the density that you're building in Copenhagen and whether your daylight sunlight regulation is different to ours here, which is quite a difficult one, which here sometimes leads to point blocks or detached, more kind of loose structures rather than the courtyard blocks. So our regulation kind of almost disincentivizes the block structure, and we're kind of battling with that a little bit on the planning front. But how do you manage to build the density and have still the quality of daylight sunlight?
Well, I think
Carlsberg, I think they're
in Carlsberg. I mean,
also Nordhavn.
There's Carlsberg and Nordhavn has some high rises, but they basically have block structures. But the thing in most of the Danish block structures is that they are no more than 12 meters deep, and apartments have never one facing just one direction, so you always have light coming through. So even if you're a block structure, you have lights coming from two sides. So basically, we are, of course, with student housing and stuff, there is the exception. But in general, you never have single aspect homes in Copenhagen. You would have blocks at 12 meters deep, which would allow apartments to actually have light from minimum two sides, which helps. And of course, in these ones, it's Carlsberg and Nordhavn. It's generally the blocks are 4 to 6 stories. Maybe a few is 7, 8, but then otherwise you have some points that go in. And I think a really important lesson also in terms of microclimate is in Carlsberg the towers are integrated in the blocks, and that means quite a lot for the experience of the microclimate
That's very interesting. And the towers I noticed were quite slender. They're quite narrow. They're not very big. So there's a question about how many districts you have in Copenhagen, and does that make things complicated? We have 17 city districts. We talked about the structure and district mayors and how this works and what streets are the city streets and the district streets. You have all this, and how do you navigate that?
We don't have it as individual entities. So the city of Copenhagen is one municipal. We do have something called the local representative, which is basically a body that sits, that's run by the city, but it's kind of a communication between residents in each neighborhood and the city. So it's sort of a small engagement, you can say, on hand, but it's not as itself its own mayor and its own jurisdiction. It's under the jurisdiction of Copenhagen.
Then there's quite a lot of more responsibility for the residents themselves to actually be involved and take action. Does it lead to some neighborhoods being where, let's say, residents are more active, have more time, more affluence, they're kind of like pushing for certain things, or?
I think this is pretty. I mean, of course, there's always areas where maybe there are more activity and less activity. I think it's at a level where it's also very much personal and who's involved in these kind of organizations. I think in many ways it works well that the city is one municipality, also from actually taking the strategies and implementing it. It allows them to think somewhat long term, that you can make a citywide strategy, and over time, a good example, the small road in the beginning where the sidewalk was pulled through, it's something that the city does when they are updating the streets anyway, and they will pull in the bike lanes, pull in the sidewalks.
I want to ask if there are any questions from the floor here. A microphone can come to you if there are. If anybody wanted to ask a question in the analog, old school way, we quite enjoy that. Otherwise, I'll have to keep my eyes sharp on the left here. How did the city motivate residents not to own a car in new neighborhoods where investors are concerned that locating parking away would reduce attractiveness? So Nordhagen, this is the city development company. I suppose that's already the approach that they're taking, but there are other developments which are other investors, developers. Have they been worried about cars being too far away from the homes of people?
I mean, I think there's several answers to it. First of all, as I said, underground parking, even by the developers, are considered too expensive and too CO2 heavy today. So that is being, of course, this has also been a journey. Car ownership, sadly, even though we're riding a bike, car ownerships are going up in Copenhagen, simply because we are a wealthy city. So of course that is a challenge, but as I said, a lot of the new areas, there is not a parking spot per apartment. At the end of the day, I would say, to live in Copenhagen, I would never, I mean, I biked to the airport this morning. I think that says it all. You know, and I'm not extreme. I biked in my suit slowly out there. It's what you do. I would never take the car inside the city, and that's true for a lot of people. From a competitive, I think we are at the point where Copenhagen, it is just accepted that if you live in Copenhagen, there is a limitation to parking, but it's also not a big challenge. As people say, it's easy, fast, convenient to take your bicycle.
Yeah, so basically, you mentioned the car ownership is rising, but basically people are not using the car on a daily basis.
Of course it is.
They take it out on a weekend
And it is, we had our national, or not, well, we also had national, but we had our municipal elections in the fall, and parking became a topic, but when you look at the votes, it wasn't a topic at all. Because it wasn't, the votes didn't go towards more parking, let's put it that way.
Our parking regulation studies is quite high number of parking that we need for developments, and this creates this makes the new development very expensive because you have to provide too much car parking, and now actually we know that we want nice neighborhoods, so we don't want that car parking on the streets, so there's underground parking which is very unsustainable. So the parking houses are a good way. We've also been to look at Aspenzersted in Vienna, where they built quite a lot of car parking houses, and the idea is that in the future those can be transformed into different uses once the cars are reduced even further down the line. So, and in Nordhavn, there were beautiful examples that you've shown, and they're kind of overgrown with greenery, or you have the playground on the roof, and so on. There's a question about private as public space, or semi-private, semi-public. This is a topic for many cities. There's also the business improvement district models and all of those things. The question is whether you think that's a good thing. I mean, I suppose if I can pre-answer, from my point of view, it's something it's not good or bad. It's a given because ownership is kind of split, and it's not continuous, and so on. So in Karlsberg, you showed how beautifully actually you don't even recognize that as a private space. But are there any disadvantages, or how do you? Where are you with this POPs, the privately owned public spaces discussion?
I think we do need collaboration at all times. I've also worked outside Denmark on areas where a developer would develop something and the city would take it over. I think there's so many different ways of doing this. I think the important is that our cities, our land is a resource, and it's a resource we need to share. Because that's part of actually also inviting us to benefit from the qualities of living in the city. And when we live in a city, our own CO2 footprint is simply smaller. I mean, because of everything that we share, from walls to infrastructure to, as I mentioned, public transport, and we're willing to compromise the amount of square meters we live on because we have shared joys. Let's put it that way, in public space and so on. So I think it's not a choice. We have to do this. And then we need to figure out how we do it, and whether it's regulation or dialogue in the local planning, regulative plans with the developers, whatever it is, we need to find ways to solve it.
I think sharing always seems more complicated and complex, but when it works, it works really well, and it creates the additional value which you mentioned. What processes are required for implementing infrastructure in Copenhagen when private land is located within the project area? I'm not sure whether I understand this question. Implementing infrastructure as in city infrastructure, I suppose, public transport, etc. I suppose that comes back to your, collaboration and coming together and having strategies and aligning those strategies. Private streets, what should happen with private streets in 20-30 years? Once they start to fall apart, well, I suppose they are in ownership, and that's...
Well, actually, the city of Copenhagen will give you, if you live a place with a private street and it doesn't live up to the requirements, you get the notion from the city that you need to repair your road. So it's very simple.
So you have to take care of your ownership, which is by default your responsibility. How would you negotiate between developers and city master plan regulations in underdeveloped areas where amenity requirements are economically unfeasible? Just to translate this question is, I suppose, where the plan regulates a certain mix of uses, and from a developer point of view that's not feasible, maybe it's further out and they need to deliver 30% mixed use, retail, etc. How to make this feasible?
I think there's something that has, of course, very much to do with the context. At the end of the day, I think there's different answers to it, because I think one thing I learned with cities is that, let's say, what we experience as part of the city is always changing. So it's always, in Copenhagen, 20 years ago, if you lived at the outer boroughs, people would thought you were crazy because it was so far from the city center. They didn't give the left arm to living there. Because the mental city sign is always moving in cities. So part of it is saying that to create something that's robust over time, we of course need to think not about what is necessarily only feasible tomorrow, but also that's a city answer maybe to it. The other answer is, of course, that we don't have the resources to build something that doesn't work. So we also have to think about what can actually work now. Can we do something that's robust enough to change over time? But also, is there, if you're building something in a more residential area, this notion of when do you come home? Is there one place where that area meets the city in a way where you can actually create something that feels like a public space and have those amenities? And it doesn't have to, of course, we don't need a high street in every new residential area at the edge of the city, but we need a place where we feel that we have arrived.
And we didn't talk about your working with other cities beyond Europe. So I'm quite interested in the lessons and maybe the common mistakes that cities make. From your experience in Shanghai and other places, like what would you say were the common mistakes, or what would you say were the common kind of wins to make in these very different contexts?
I think what we do when we work with cities is actually very much, there is so much regulation and technique and all of these things. There's so many people that are so great at that. But at the end, it's also communication. And it's making everyone understand, get a direction that you can contribute to. So one example is I was working on a strategy for public space for Shanghai Harbor. So 120 kilometers of harborfront, downtown Shanghai, 60 kilometers on each side, 8 different municipality, harbor authority, higher, I think. And they had all these kind of things, so they did an expo and they did a wonderful park, and it ended in a wall and it started in a wall, and of course no one used it after the expo because you couldn't go there. And so we were, this was at my time with wonderful guild, and we were asked to come in and help them with a strategy. And we said, you need a strategy that's so simple that you just get it. So we said it's one continuous public space. It should connect to local neighborhoods and public transport. It should be diversified in programming to all age groups, and buildings along the waterfront should have ground floor connection to the public spaces. And then we made a quality guide, not a design guide, but a quality guide to support those 4 elements. And I think we did the strategy in 15, 16, and they first invited me back in 18, and I think then they invited me back in 23, and in 23 they had built 60 kilometers of continuous public space along the waterfront. Now that might speak to a very efficient democracy, but it also shows that if you find a way to actually bridge that communication, that everyone from the developer to the different mayors to the different designers to the different guys doing the construction, if you find a way to actually communicate in a way that we can, and it's not to oversimplify cities because they are so complex, we have to respect that, but it is sometimes you need to find that thing that allows everybody to do their best in succeeding with the goal.
It's the visioning, it's back to the visioning and actually communicating that vision very clearly, not dumbing it down, but actually making sure that everybody gets it. I mean, in Bratislava, I suppose we're in this process of finding our identity and thinking about our identity, and start with children. It's a big part of that because in a way, for me, I lived in London for 15 years, which is almost 9 million people city, and lived there with a small child, and coming back to Bratislava, there's a lot of quality of life for families with children. I think I'm quite convinced about that because we have the nature, the proximity to nature, we have lakes to swim in. The city is quite small, it's relatively, you could say, compact, even though it's not high density. We want to make it more compact in terms of the density. But I think Bratislava is kind of thinking about itself as a child-friendly city. We are, that's why we are here. It starts with children, but we're also working with primary schools and doing the school street transformations, working with school communities. This has a lot to do with the idea of belonging, because we feel as a young democracy we should be working with the youngest generations to make them engaged and active in thinking about their responsibility and this idea of sustainable behavior that you talk about. So hopefully tomorrow when you go and look around the Freedom Square and other places, that you might observe that quality of life that might be emerging and have thoughts on that. Is there anyone in the audience who would like to make some comments or questions, or how do you, maybe we should ask you, who from you feel like Bratislava is a child-friendly city from our audience? Do you think Bratislava is a child-friendly city? Well, surprisingly not that many, which, well, it's in progress, do you have any questions for Kristian or comments, Boris?
more child-friendly when you were kids?
I think it was more child-friendly when we were kids. It's nice because of the cars and everything. But when we were kids, we were just biking around here in the street and playing. And now it's impossible, basically. But it's also in the shift of the mindset of the society, maybe. How we treat kids these days.
Yeah, we opened a big topic there, yeah.
How we treated them before, like no play, and now, don't play. So it's a matter of perspective.
I think there's a wonderful British study of 3 or 4 generations of how far they could move. I'm sure some of you are aware of it. And I was thinking a little bit about it when I was invited down here because we talk about with children. And now I mentioned already that my daughter from a young age could walk to school because she felt she was never crossing a road. In fact, she crossed 5 or something like that, but the sidewalk would pull through. And my son, he's 15, we never know where he is because he has a bicycle and he has a bus card and he just uses the metro, the buses and the bikes, and then he uses all of Copenhagen. And I think it is quite nice that we can create areas where kids are not necessarily driven everywhere and where we don't have to observe them at all times, that they can actually be allowed to feel freedom and also by having freedom feel responsibility. And I think that's something that would be nice to aim for.
Yeah, freedom and responsibility. I think that's a really good note to finish, unless anyone has a really pressing comment or question. I am delighted that we've had Kristian here. It's been a really great conversation. So many topics that I'm thinking about that could be, standalone talks and lectures, because I think you addressed such a rounded way of looking at everything from policy through financial models through the sense of belonging, collaboration and interdisciplinary way of thinking, partnerships, sustainability, policies. So a lot of food for thought for our audience, I hope, and those of you who are joining us online today. Let's have a big round of applause for Kristian Villadsen from Copenhagen. Thank you so much for being here. And as for the next Start with Children, you can follow us on startwithchildren.com or at tuba.mib.sk. Next week we will already have Eva Karel here from Vienna. She's the famous gender mainstreaming planning expert. So we will continue on this big challenging topic of master planning and city making from slightly different angles. And I think it will be a very interesting discussion as well. So enjoy the rest of your evening, and thank you for joining us again.